time for the conversation is now, but the time for action is also now. We need to look at really, can we find a plan that makes America successful? Because in 2 years, we may be too far behind. We need to find solutions now. We need to find compromise. We need to look at what works to solve the affordability crisis. And it's not just an affordability crisis, but it's also a scarcity crisis.
July 4th, 2025 featured fireworks of a different kind for the renewable energy industry. With the swipe of a pen, President Donald Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act into law and assigned folks like you, listening to this podcast, a whole lot of catch-up reading to do after the holiday to see how the final draft of that legislation would impact you. I remember those few days well. The OBBB cut off runways for investment tax credits, or ITC, eligibility for some renewable energy technologies, including big ones like wind and solar, effective 1 year since its enactment, which, if you're near a calendar and listening to this close to the time it was recorded, is just in the rear view. Some stuff like batteries retain the incentives promised by former President Biden's landmark Inflation Reduction Act, and thank goodness for that, as we continue to see just how much of an impact energy storage can have on our grid. But solar and wind really got the short end in favor of fossil fuels, creating a bit of a mad scramble across the industry to capitalize on those legacy ITCs while they still existed. And that meant safe harboring equipment like transformers and custom racking to satisfy start of construction qualifications on as many projects as possible before July 4th. Well, now that well is dry. The fireworks are done. Those one-time upfront credits no longer apply to some of the fastest to deploy and reasonably costing power generation tech. So how the heck do we keep building the energy projects we need to support the grid during this era of rapid load growth? On this edition of the Factor This podcast, presented in partnership with Advanced Energy United, we intend to find out. Hey everybody, I'm Factor This content director Paul Gerke. Thank you so much for checking out the show. I'm joined this week by a trio of guests that are ready to assess the current landscape and peer into the future. Perhaps ITCs will one day return. We begin with our friends at Advanced Energy United, Dylan Reed, Managing Director, making his first appearance on the show. Dylan, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. Thank you so much for finding the time.
Thanks, Paul. Happy to be on today with my debut here for our pod. Dylan Reed, Managing Director for Federal and Political Affairs at Advanced Energy United. Have spent about a decade in both the advocacy and public service side of doing some work in the federal administration at the Department of Energy, and trying to figure out how we get more financing into the infrastructure needed as a part of this. But now oversee all of our federal and political work here. Just this week, an event meeting with governors where the central focus is how do we build things faster to get prices down for consumers. So happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
And Dylan buried the lead just a little bit. He's not just at an event. He's up in my old neck of the woods in Michigan, way up north, Mackinac Island, where the reception is not exactly world class. We're a few decades behind on telecoms up there for the betterment of the experience, not necessarily for the podcast listeners. So if Dylan cuts out at any point there, you can blame the cell phone reception. We'd love to introduce our friends over at Monarch who found the time to join the show today as well. Walter, let's start with you.
Sure. Glad to be on, Paul, and looking forward to our conversation. I'm Walter McLeod, and I'm a managing director and a partner of Monarch Strategic Ventures, which is a state-oriented and DER affiliate of Monarch Private Capital, which my colleague is going to talk to at length. I've been working in energy and environment for the past several decades, cut my teeth working on public policy at the federal level. But for the past several years, I've been focusing on the synergy between state policy and federal policy, and particularly trying to craft state policy as a catalyst for innovating at the federal level. So I've been with Monarch for about 3 years. It sort of rounds out my experience on public policy, project development, and now the finance space. And I'm really glad to be here and talk about what we're trying to do to catalyze ITCs at the state level.
Great to have you, Walter. Brian, last but not least.
Sure. Brian Didier. I'm a partner at Monarch Private Capital and managing director of the energy team. I've been doing energy project finance for over 20 years. And with until the last 3 years, that was really in an external or internal legal counsel role. And 3 years ago, I moved over to Monarch to run the team here, where we work with our investor clients with tax mitigation solutions. What that means is purchasing or investing in structures that are going to yield federal tax credits. I run the energy team. We do $1.5 billion plus of these credit transactions per annum. So we are very interested in monitoring very closely and working on what could be next and what is happening with the federal energy credits you talked about earlier. I sometimes like to tack on that I've got another 10 years of wind experience, because prior to all that, I did the normal pipeline to renewable energy of flying Navy helicopters. So when you
just
see
casually dropping that in.
yeah, if you see the fan in the background spinning and you're watching the podcast, that just keeps me right at home to always have a rotor over my head.
I thought it was a cool propeller that you had there, Brian. I do like
It
the
may
spinning
very well
propeller.
be.
Anyone watching the video version might be and got a laugh out of that. I'd
Creates
love
a
to talk
halo
more
effect.
about what's
Yeah,
that, Walter?
it creates a halo effect around you, Brian. It's nice.
You guys are already exchanging pleasantries. I love the camaraderie on the show.
You might be able to hear the clopping of the horse-drawn carriages behind me. So we're really carrying just all forms of modes of transportation on this call.
Yeah, we're
We
taking
always
you
said
from the
that the
beginning to the
helicopter is
end.
the modern variant of a horse. There you go.
Somebody fire up a Model T in the background and complete the circuit, would you please? You guys are great. Would love to talk about the future and quite frankly, where we are right now. But I think in order to get our best handle on that part of the conversation, we should take a quick look back at what this last year has been like. My conversations with folks in the industry has been that it's been a unique year. A lot of these incentives were laid out to 2030 in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then, in very short notice, a lot of them saw their runways significantly cut off, and now projects that start construction that are building wind and solar aren't eligible to tap into those same ITCs that Brian works with all the time. So I guess maybe let's start the conversation with what has the last year been like from your perspective after the passage of the one big beautiful bill. Brian, let's go over to you first.
Yeah, I mean, it really, to continue the wind theme, it's really been a whirlwind. Um, we've had first of all, we had the OBQ, and that reset the ground game, really reset the rules. And everyone was aware there were really two horizons within that for solar and wind, but there was a separate horizon essentially for all technologies. That first horizon was the end of 2025, because along with the termination or phase out of the federal credits for wind and solar, we had the implementation of the new FIAC rules, or foreign entity of concern rules, which work in a couple different ways relative to equipment usage, contracting, or ownership of facilities that set a separate regime up. So the first sort of timeline was the end of 2025. And for projects that began construction during that, they essentially were exempted from certain portions of FIAC relative to material assistance, which is where the equipment can come from. Then, as you mentioned, Paul, there was the secondary deadline that was July 4th of this year for wind and solar projects to commence construction. So there's been a tremendous amount of activity among the development side, but that also means there's been a tremendous amount of activity at the investment side and the equity and the debt side of trying to figure out, how do we finance these projects given some of the uncertainties? If they begin construction, they still have to complete by a certain deadline. Where do we look? And it's sort of driven a bit of, from the investment, anything that's going to use those credits, there's a bit of a primacy among the credits as to projects that have begun construction by the end of 2024 are under yet a third regime, because they may still be under the older Section 48 or Section 45. They have neither the cliff of a begin construction date or a 2027 have to be placed in service, nor the FIAC implementation. So we saw a lot of interest in those projects kind of come to the top as the most certain to develop, subject to they've got to place in service by the end of 2028. And then we just saw a lot of conversations going on. Okay, do the strategies that you had talked about, Paul, to begin construction we've worked in the past, do they still operate? Well, then shortly after the bill was signed, we've got, you know, an executive order followed by a new Treasury notice that sort of rewrote a little bit of that begun construction requirements and removed what was the ability to spend cost in advance and said, no, we need physical work done, whether on or off site. So it's been a shifting landscape. It's been hectic, but that allows people to really distinguish the value they bring. And we've seen some firms be very successful in planning and executing this. We've seen others not do so well. So it's created a little bit of M&A in the industry, but it's created a lot of opportunity. I think the net results, for better or for worse, at least on the solar and wind side, is we likely have more projects coming online by the end of 2030 than we would have had absent OB cubed, because people have really tried to accelerate their timeline. Now, whether we succeed in that is really going to be the question of, does the permitting side, does the state regulatory side that Walter can talk a lot more to, advantage or disadvantage those developments? And there are other barriers there that preclude them, but that's going to be a little bit of how much personnel can we bring to actually then build these projects. And then, of course, we still have a lot of credit opportunities on a go forward that will be available through what was the prior duration we had on the Inflation Reduction Act. So we will still have credits at full quantity or full capacity for that very, very important storage component, for fuel cells, for geothermal, for other tech neutral credits through the end of 2037. So this isn't a death knell for the renewable energy, but it is, once again, another reshaping of the landscape.
When we got in the trenches on OB3, it immediately occurred to me, with the change in leadership at the White House and the consolidation across the Congress and at least, you know, in leadership, that we needed to pivot to the other rail that often gets overlooked, which is states. And we were members of United, and we saw on the horizon, the opportunity to shape a record number, I think, of gubernatorial elections that were on the horizon. The first two being in New Jersey and Virginia last fall, and then this year, I think there are upwards of 36 gubernatorial races in play. So, and this is typical when you see this kind of sea change in government at the federal level, that the advocates who are a bit out of favor will pivot to the state level. So that's what we did, and it makes sense because, as Brian may have mentioned earlier, Monarch is active in tax syndication across multiple verticals. Energy is the biggest part of our business, but we also are active in affordable housing, in historic properties, and film. And a lot of that happens at the state level, state policy and state tax credits, to complement whatever is available at the federal level. So it makes sense for us to have a strategy that would create, to enhance our play in the energy space, to have a strategy that would promote state energy tax credits along with what we're doing at the federal level. There was one really good example of a successful state tax credit that we as Monarch, it was before my time, utilized and helped propel a state from 40th in the country plus to number 2 behind California, and that is North Carolina. And so we looked at what they've done, the success of that program, and unfortunately, it's been sunset because of a change in political dynamic in the state now. But we think what was done there can be replicated and updated to meet our current challenges in the clean energy, advanced energy space. So we worked hard, and Brian didn't allude to this because it's not. I don't think it's great going back and revisiting the whole saga of the OB3 battles, but we were very active in trying to shape that to a favorable outcome. And I give kudos to United, the other trades, especially, and on our team too. We were active in significantly blunting the impact that could have happened to the industry with what went down a year ago on July 4th. So yeah, I think it created an opening for us now, and we're emboldened to do more at the state level because that's where the opportunity really exists to catalyze the federal.
I can't wait to get into a little more about what states can do to promote renewable energy proliferation, apart from all the federal efforts. But before we do, you set the table really nicely for Dylan with the hat tip to Advanced Energy United for stymieing what could have been a much more disastrous piece of legislation for the industry. Dylan, I don't necessarily need you to go through and relive all of that, but what do you recall from that process, and what has the last year been like for your organization and their stakeholders?
For us, we have always primarily been state focused, where we've looked at opportunities for policy to move forward. But as a part of that, obviously, federal policy is an incredibly important lever to either positively or negatively impact this. And so we were actively involved during all of those negotiations, meeting with folks in a productive way to show where that is. And I think, whether it was last year or even now, every business you talk to, what they are looking for is certainty. They need to understand what the certainty is to allow for some of these investments that, some of the projects that we're talking with companies, they take 15 years. And part of that is the permitting process and how long that takes. But the lack of certainty, whether it is from tax purposes or permitting side of things, makes it harder for companies like Monarch to be able to invest and make sure that the money that they're putting behind that can actually move forward on where that's going. Now, fortunately, there are a lot of allies inside Congress that understand what certainty means for business. And I think that really did blunt the worst drafts that were out there that would have, essentially canceled signed contracts. And so, while you have seen, as Brian said, that there's been a whirlwind, because I think, we're talking about tens of billions of canceled projects announced in the last year because of the change in policy and what that meant as a part of that. And so the lack of certainty really leads to a change in investment altogether. Moving forward, where we're looking at this is like, how do we provide that certainty both in the federal and state level?
Yeah, I think that's the big word of the day. If we were gonna to hang a banner up and it said one word on it, it would be certainty. And I know there are some in the space that think that the renewable sector is better without the federal ITCs. I think there are plenty that would say they're the lifeblood of what they do on a day-to-day basis, and it's terrible that they're going away, and hopefully they come back. But I think regardless of where you fall, in that, you want certainty. Investment decisions are often scuttled by not knowing how much something is going to cost, or when something is going to go into construction, or when it's going to come out of construction. And so just having a benchmark, even if it's 5 years, even if your money is going to be tied up for however long, just having that often gets stuff across the finish line. Walter and Brian, I want to open it up to either of you to talk a little bit more about that certainty point and the ways that you think we
Yeah.
can pull the levers to create that certainty that we need to get projects onto the grid.
Yeah, and we actually talk about that a lot. There really are 4 C's, because the first thing is you need certainty that there's a law or a policy that exists. Secondly, you need clarity on what that law or policy is. And then finally, you need consistency on how that law or a policy will be applied, which then builds the 4th C, which is the confidence to then pursue a business plan. And whether that's an investment plan or whether that's a development plan, that's what we're always answering to our investors and purchaser clients, is making sure we talk to that CFO or that tax director. She is looking for a minimum 5-year business plan and tax mitigation strategy. And that's what we're trying to offer. So going back to that, the first thing is that certainty of what the law is. We have had other factors over the past year and consistently during my work in this industry the past 20 years on some of those other factors. And so undoing those really helps. And that's a key point where you get the blend of the state and the federal, because the federal overlay is tremendously important. You have to know what that is, but then the state can really unlock things by different state policies. I mean, I'll humbly say I come from Kansas, and I know Dylan's up in Michigan right now. You know, we're still working on our Y1K problem, much less Y2K. So, we can talk about how advanced various states are in areas, but you do see development and opportunity flock to various states based on the state policy and where the climate is good. Somebody can hit the drum there for using my climate is good. But where the climate is good for development of various kinds, and we see state do it all the times. They want to attract certain businesses, certain occupations, certain people. They make laws that assist that. So the state policy aspect is really important to that. But again, all starts with that certainty. We need a law, and then we can operate under that law or policy. But within that, we've got to make sure that we've got that clarity and consistency so that we do truly have confidence. And that continues at the federal level, I would say, to be a bit of a slow build. Because while we had the OB cubed that changed the code, we are still waiting for certain aspects of the regulations to give greater amplification to various credits and how they are used, particularly within that FIAC regime that I mentioned earlier. So there are still things out there that we maybe don't have that full level of clarity that is slowing investment in the market or slowing development that we hope to break loose and really unleash the full potential of American ingenuity to meet the moment. Because let's face it, we are in a position right now where we're in an energy crisis, and there is real hunger for power and ability to access that power. And we need to meet that moment, and we need to do so in a manner that isn't so cost prohibitive that it impacts the life of the average American, whether that's for goods or services or what they pay their power bills, or impacts them by what could be investment with AI and data centers and development and technology in the US flocking overseas because we don't have the right policies to do that. Again, that moving from energy to even data centers is both a federal and state overlay that really allows us to succeed there. So I think it's just important to recognize how those two necessarily play together.
And if I could pick up on that, Brian, and a little bit of Paul, what you were saying on this, some of this uncertainty is, we had the draft FIAC, which I think this audience is probably sophisticated enough that they understand this, all the acronyms getting thrown out. But that was put out earlier this year. And we keep hearing that there's going to be an update at it by the end of this year. But that lag of several months is the uncertainty in which I have talked to all of our members that are saying we can move forward under this guidance, but until there's actual certainty around that, we can't get financing. And we can't have investors that are willing to do that until they know exactly where that's going. So we continue to ask for more certainty to move forward, even under this tax regime of like, okay, you passed these new policies, but we need more certainty around where it's actually going to go in order to get investment to move forward.
That guidance we got is an IRS notice. And so getting into even more technical parlance, that's sub-regulatory guidance. It isn't necessarily binding, and the scope of that guidance really focused more on the math problem of assembling a numerator and denominator for the material assistance portion of FIAC, but it didn't answer a lot of the other important definitional questions that may impact those inputs or may impact the ownership prong. And that's where you're noting, Dylan, that we're still waiting for Treasury regulations that would then have greater force and effect and give confidence to the market relative to development and then the financing behind that for both a debt and an equity aspect.
When you look back at OB3 and the lessons learned there, I was astonished, and it was a bit ironic that we were pointing to the majority of projects that were deployed in red states as opposed to blue states. And I think part of the reason that was the case, even though, within the Beltway, it was, it was the delegates from the blue states that led to the IRA and its generosity, but the red states were the ones benefiting from it because they had much more flexible permitting and local regulatory requirements, and that shouldn't be the case. It's a disconnect in terms of consistency. You can have the most powerful, most generous federal subsidies and tax credit program you want. But if you can't deploy at the state level because it's a quagmire there, it just creates a bottleneck. So, I think it's really important to have those in sync. And certainly that's part of what we hope to help accomplish during this sort of time period between 2026 and 2028 is a blueprint so that we can create more unity in how we approach both the federal and state energy value chain, because it's right now there's a huge disconnect, and you see it with data centers, for example. That's probably the most glaring example of it today.
I've worked in energy for over 10 years, and it's only in the last 6 months that my family has started calling me about why are my energy bills so high. And so, when we talk about this lack of uncertainty and finance, the finance side of this staying on the sidelines because of the lack of uncertainty, it directly leads back into higher bills for folks. And as we head into the election season, this is what folks are asking about. And we can get investment going forward. And the conversations I've had up here in Mackinac this week have all been around how can we get things built faster. And so, governors are now turning to that and asking us specifically on what are the ideas? How can I move this faster because it's taking too long? One governor I was meeting with this was talking around how they were excited around they were able to get some projects developed in under 5 years. And the next governor sitting next to me was just like, oh my gosh, I'm talking around 15 years for things to move forward. And so we've got to move faster around all of these permitting elements as a part of that. I saw that during my time in the federal government side of things where we couldn't get a signature from someone. And so it took an extra 6 months for a project just to get the permit they needed, just because somebody was out of office. Things like that shouldn't happen, right? We're not talking about rolling back environmental concerns. We're talking around how can we move things faster just by having better processes, better state laws in place that allows for us to actually go build things so that when my mom calls me, I can say, trust me, your bills are going to start coming.
Well said, Dylan. I appreciate you bringing your mom's perspective into this. I too am starting to get the questions about energy prices and why things are the way they are. And my answer lately has been, how much time do you got? Do you want to sit down and chat a little bit? Because the issue is more complicated than just how much you're seeing on your bill. To back up the conversation just a little bit, if your head was spinning during all of the acronyms being thrown around, I can help with those a little bit. FEOC, the one you keep hearing, the Foreign Entities of Concern, or sometimes used PFE as it appears in the legislation, prohibited foreign entities. That guidance, I believe the IRS notice came out in February. Ryan, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I remember hearing we were going to get something by June. We were going to get something in early July. At the time of this recording, we still haven't seen anything. With our luck, it'll come out right before the podcast goes live, and we'll all be eating our words on it. But I know that that's something that we've really been hearing over and over again that people are waiting for in order to move projects forward. In fact, I know the first FEOC financing solutions came to market just recently that have that risk built in just in case things go sideways with one piece of guidance or another, that these investors still felt safe. I want to talk about how we build stuff now, because once that dust settles and those legacy tax credits that Brian laid out so eloquently, the finer vintages fall by the wayside, we still need the energy. We still have to feed the beast of that demand that we keep talking about in every conversation. Well, how do we do that? Walter, you talked about one smart way that states might be able to help facilitate. If you want to start there with the state level, I'd love to go there. And then Dylan and Brian, feel free to jump in with the larger thoughts around how we might be able to actually get stuff built, even if we don't have the ITCs we've been relying on for a few years.
Yeah, Paul. So at United, within our working with within Monarch Strategic Ventures, we have we've proposed an approach to a state energy innovation bill. And it's meant to address affordability while also create sort of a catalyst for speed and scale, right? To get more power on the grid and do it faster. Um, and so the construct of that it takes the form of an energy dividend and tax credit. That's the idea. Okay. It's a new idea. It's something that we within Monarch are starting to socialize with states to get a sense of how we're able to both help them solve the energy deployment problem and incentivize that while at the same time create resiliency and address some affordability issues that they're dealing with on a everyday basis from ratepayers. And so we started the process earlier this year in Virginia, and we floated a model bill. It didn't have the energy dividend component, but that was because we started to learn about how important affordability was, not only for state lawmakers, but for everyone. Right? It's become probably the defining issue going into the midterms. And so, over the past few months, as we've been talking both with the folks in Virginia, as well as in other states that we're looking at potentially doing this in, we put together a model that's based on the spirit of what you see in the permanent fund that comes out of Alaska, right? So in Alaska, they have a program where it's different. It's oil and gas royalties, but there's a payback that goes to residents of the state, right? And so they benefit from helping to subsidize the energy production in that state as taxpayers. And so this approach that we are currently working on allows for a tangible monetary benefit to go back to ratepayers that allows them to buy in to the idea of creating a tax credit stimulus to deploy more advanced energy at the state level. Now, mind you, what they do at the state level is in no way compares to what the federal government is able to do, because state governments have to balance their budget every year, right? So there's a limit to how much they can do, but what they do can be meaningful. I mean, like we said about the example of North Carolina, to go from 40th in the country to number 2 in the country, primarily on the back of a state tax credit, is phenomenal. So it can be a powerful tool, but we just need to sort of create a model that can be deployed and modified to the circumstances within each state. So again, a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work when you do this across the individual states. Each state has different resources. The politics of each state is very different. A Democrat in New York is not the same as a Democrat in Texas or a Democrat in Arizona. And so we have to recognize that. And I think that's, for the industry, it's important for us to advance policy that takes that into account and allows us to reach our objective, which is speed and scale with advanced energy, right? But also accommodates the nuances of each market. And you have to, really customize your approach to some extent around the edges so that you can accommodate those changes. And you can accommodate the needs and the advantages that each market has. So that's at a very high level, sort of the conceptual framework that we're working on, using in partnership with our colleagues at United, and trying to push forward states as a laboratory for faster and more meaningful deployment of clean energy.
Fortunately, as I said, we're focused on states, and we have a playbook on what states can do to actually move forward projects. The number one point on our playbook, and the number one question I get from state legislators and governors, is, we need to build it. Can we build faster? And so there's a lot of different ways to unlock that. I think one of the biggest elements is some states have made it either impossible or extremely difficult through their siting laws in terms of whether or not you can actually build in your state. In Michigan, they have taken a forward looking view on this and have really set a great, exciting path forward for clean energy generation and being able to build that. The second thing is there's a lot of new technologies that introduce more flexibility into the grid. So you just don't have to build a large new generation side of things, but we can get more out of the existing grid and being able to do that. And lastly, we are all talking about affordability. There's a lot of different mechanisms to move forward on how we make it affordable. And so if states lead on those three things, we think that's an opportunity to go build things faster and then lead to lower bills.
Brian, I'm curious. I'd love to direct one your way. What's been the reaction to these changes in the ITC? We have obviously hammered the nail of a need for consistency over and over again, but as things changed, I imagine that different companies of varying sizes and scales and flexibility are probably hit with this a little differently and probably can manage it or afford to manage it a little differently. What has that been like from Monarch's perspective in dealing with the sort of back and forth of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. So I think, just kind of stepping back, I think there is a very common acknowledged sentiment that the ITC has been the most transformative aspect of the renewable energy industry, right? We don't get to the scale and size, and in fact, we don't get to the technological advancements we have, or even the onshoring of manufacturing been able to achieve so far without an ITC that has been the driver of that's been a propellant, right? So that's acknowledged, and people have different positions of where that should be going forward. But with a pathway for it to still be available, it is a very significant part of the available part of the capital stack. People have not ignored that. So what we have seen in this time of a limited pathway for wind and solar, even planning around the FIOC aspects, there are some of the haves and have-nots. Some of the larger companies that have more access to internal capital resources. When you talk about that begun construction, Paul, there was competition for finite resources on a finite timeline.
Mhm.
And those who can order more and pay a little more received more. Some of the others were a little bit left out. So what we're seeing is, going back to that, a little bit of an opportunity for consolidation. There are some very, very good and solid projects out there. There's a question for if those are wind and solar, can they really beat the 2027 timeline? So how do we marry some of that begun construction work with those? Is some of the consolidation and changing we're seeing going on there. And then obviously as well, for laying out that timeline to have to the 29 or 2030 timeline, it's the same thing. And this is not a new chapter we're writing in the story, because we have been through a series since we first started. First, looking back to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009 and the advent of a 1603 grant. Every stage we've had with either an upcoming cliff or a new incentive, there is a rush to take advantage of those. So what does that mean go forward? Well, there certainly are some who say, well, maybe I'm positioned so that my best case, looking back to that, where do I have confidence? I can have more confidence without a credit. I can have a path there. But let's sort of face the facts of what that means. Renewable energy for sources such as wind or solar, right, particularly, or even geothermal, you're talking about things that don't require a feedstock that has a cost, logistics, or commodity component to it. That's just a fact. Oil, natural gas, even anything that's, there's other, even coal, right? We've got a commodity that is necessary to create that energy. That price can have variability depending on that resource. Again, wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear do not have that. What those have in common, though, is generally the upfront cost to build that is more expensive. The whole idea of the ITC is defray that capital stack, allow that to come online faster, and then you're using less capital across the board to do more projects. Once built, I'll go to my neighbor, sort of the Northwest. If you build it, they will come, to go back to Field of Dreams, right? And if you build those renewable energy resources, the electrons are going to come. You don't need, with coal or natural gas, say, okay, it's built, it will come, but it may come at a price. It may come at a scarcity if I can't access that feedstock. So there's a lot of debate going forward. Do we want the ITC to be reconstituted for wind and solar? Do we want it for other technologies? And I think there's a general sense that there may be, certainly there's support on both sides of Congress for it. We don't see it as much in the administration, but there's a great question of, if we want that confidence and certainty going forward, how do we create something that will retain that bipartisan support and can be bought by all? And what we look at is the narrative has moved from a we're for an all of the above strategy, with now the AI race and the energy demand of suddenly our prognostications are for a quickly escalating energy demand, which we've been flat before. That really gets back to the affordability. So it's now an any of the above. And maybe we need to think about what are appropriate government supplements across the board. And we know that the fossil fuel industry, like it or not, has since the very beginnings enjoyed federal supplements, subsidies of some sort. They may sit a little differently than what we've had on the renewable side, but other energy resources have those. Let's look at how do we truly level the playing field, but level the playing field in a way that promotes American energy independence, which means we're not beholden on others, but also allows us to be dominant in the field, which means we are exporting technology, know-how, and fuels where those are available. And so that's the question: is what does that new policy look like? How do we get everyone together to build for what is truly the best for the U.S.? There's a lot of debate around that.
I certainly agree with Brian on those points. I think in this conversation, especially for those who are contemplating, not going back to a solar or wind ITC, they're not thinking about entities that have taken advantage of that don't have the balance sheet of larger entities like churches and other public buildings that they are able to defray a significant amount of capital expense to deploy energy resources and sell that, the value of the tax credit to lower their costs for their parishioners. And the folks who are in the commercial space aren't thinking about that. So there's a whole nother, and this is because the group that I'm with, we focus on a lot of the DER applications, and that's where those kinds of entities fall into the fray. So I think that you have to broaden the aperture and look at the full scope of entities, as Brian said, who are benefiting from the existence of this policy, this transformative policy decision that's been with us for over 20 years, and has been working. It was established in a nonpartisan way and has been working phenomenally to make America a leader on energy deployment, especially advanced energy deployment. And we just have to come to our senses and think more strategically going forward. I think we can't spend, like, let's say things change in 2028 and there's a change in Congress and there's a real opportunity. Well, don't spend the first 2 years trying to undo everything that's happened for the past 4 years. That's what you should do, is figure out now and hit the ground running in 2028 with a plan that can be implemented and deployed immediately. Take a lesson from the playbook we just witnessed. Okay, hit the ground running and be ready to go. And the industry, it's incumbent on the industry to prepare and convene among themselves and build that strategy and plan right now. Because the next year and a half are going to go very fast.
Dylan, you've got a firsthand look at how that pathway is coming together. How does it look from your perspective?
Would encourage everyone to think around nuance as a part of this. So a lot of the conversations I have around next steps is, should we do all of it or should we do none of it? And I think the better question there is, are we going to move forward with financial support to support energy development in the United States? And what does that look like? At what levers? For what technologies? And what's the best way forward on that? If we take this as you either do it one way or you don't do it at all, that is the wrong way to start the conversation and the wrong way to set policy moving forward. And I think that's where Walter and Brian are really getting at is what is the full scope as a part of that and what does investment looking forward. And I think that's where policymakers are trying to get at. And we want to be at the table to help craft what that looks like to make sure we can get investment in America quickly and lower costs.
It really is going back to the new narrative of any of the above. We have a need for energy. I've got a son that works for a data center company, big data center company. I want to see them succeed. I want to see us succeed in that race. I've also got a daughter that works for a renewable energy company. I want energy that is secure. I do want to maximize what we can do from the clean space. We've got to recognize that we do have resources. How can we use all of those resources smartly and pursue a policy? And therefore, I think that, the time for the conversation is now, but the time for action is also now. We need to look at really, can we find a plan that makes America successful? Because in 2 years, we may be too far behind. We need to find solutions now. We need to find compromise. We need to look at what works to solve the affordability crisis. And it's not just an affordability crisis, but it's also a scarcity crisis. So we really are focused on scale and speed. What can be done that meets the scale of the moment? What can be done that meets the speed of the moment? And let's embrace all of those resources. And that has to be part of that policy discussion. That policy discussion needs to move forward in the near term.
Absolutely. And the states can catalyze that speed and scale right now. That's why the states are so important. And we need to plant the seeds that create that any of the above, as Brian mentioned, future for the United States and for the betterment of the country.
How much of this pushback against renewables, in particular solar and wind, do you think is just partisanship that's sort of driven by the same old green technology talking points, or maybe even just pushback from the administration against those specific technologies for old axes that have been grinded over the course of decades, particularly with the offshore wind stuff? Or do you think that we really are getting to a point where opinions are softening up to the point, especially on solar, where it's like, we need the energy and we don't particularly care that it comes from solar anymore? We'll drop the whole focus on fossil fuels, at least in so much as inhibiting the development of solar.
Yeah, but
I
it goes
think,
back to that any of the above narrative. We were using an all of the above, and
Yeah.
that had been embraced on the Republican side. I was at an event recently where I heard the any of the above coming out of a lot of Republican Congress members, and I think you're exactly right. We have seen softening, and of course, we've seen direct support. I mean, Representative Fitzpatrick introduced a bill just to retain solar and wind credit, essentially undo that the termination of those credits and the phase out. So there is support, and we think that support is a lot broader, and we think that support is well placed because we do need energy. But in doing that, we don't need to go back to the idea of we've picked winners and losers and that metronome that we're constantly chasing. Let's create confidence in America and confidence for the constituents and the residents of the U.S. and those who are consumers, be it business, be it individuals, and pursue a sound energy policy that does things at the state and federal level to unlock grid capacity, really be smart about transmission planning and the growth that we have, but also provide that necessary generation from what those available sources can be. And there needs to be a mix of all of those to meet the moment.
yeah, and I just to echo that point, we need to have leaders and policymakers that are fluent in energy policy and that understand and don't default to the partisan bickering that is just a vortex that has drug people in. Remember, the ITCs were forged in a bipartisan way because energy is not a partisan issue. We all use it. We all have advantages because of it, and we all benefit when we have abundant energy. And so we just have to get the politics out of it and try to find a way, leaders who understand that. We see this, a great example of this is affordable housing. So again, I mentioned we are active in affordable housing at Monarch. Affordable housing is not really a partisan issue whether you're at the state level or at the federal level. Not for the most part. And so what can we learn from that and then take over and bring back into the energy debate and discussion so that we start to look at it as just an essential need that everyone has? That's what I think we need to figure out.
That's really well said, Walter. I'm glad you brought that perspective in, especially comparing to the affordable housing. I think we get out over our skis a little bit with partisanship, particularly in the energy space, where when I flip my light on, I don't give a damn if that generation came from coal or it came from gas or it came from wind or solar. I obviously have my preferences. But in that moment, this past weekend, when I lost power, I would have taken generation from anything, including the gas generator that runs on unleaded sitting out in my shed, right? And so I think when you really get down to brass tacks and you put people into a compromising position where they don't have the availability, it starts to make the pie in the sky conversations about how do we address these problems very real. And I think people are more than willing to accept energy from any of the above, particularly in this time where we need as much of it as we can. I would love to have more time on this podcast, but unfortunately, we're already quickly approaching the hour mark. And I know you guys have got other important conversations to have, people to do, babies to kiss, hands to shake, things like that. So before I send you off into the ether, I'd love to get one last tidbit for our viewers and listeners before you all go, sort of encapsulating your point about the larger discussion we've had today. Everything back from what the last year has been like to what the pathway to building a project is now to potentially the return of some larger federal tax credits, maybe with a twist or perhaps more creatively put together. Whoever wants to go first, please.
I'll jump in and I'll just say, we need to recognize that what we've seen from our particular industry is resiliency. And what we've always seen from our country is resiliency. And what we've always seen is the country come together to get things right. So let's embrace this just as another opportunity to do that as we still are in the wake of our 250th anniversary. Let's celebrate the opportunity to come together and find solutions that allow us to continue to persevere as the ultimate destination nation for everyone else and who people still want to be.
Yeah, I think that we're at an epic threshold of dynamic change in our country, and our economy is changing in ways that are generational. I mean, you will look 20 years into the future, and we won't recognize a lot of what we see today. And so I think that what we have to do is, as part of the acknowledgement that we are shifting our society and our economy, is that we change the way we think about how we power that, because power is going to be essential to everything we do, even more so than it is or has been in our recent history.
Very well said. And I got to say, I appreciate the patriotic ethos of this show in general, being taped the week after 4th of July. I didn't think we'd get so red, white, and blue in this program, but we really did. And I appreciate you guys bringing it all back into the idea that we're in this fight together and we're going to deal with the rolling brownouts or the blackouts together too if we don't get the right solutions in place. So it's about time to wrap up this edition of the podcast, but before I go, one last thank you to Dylan over at Advanced Energy United and Walter and Brian at Monarch for finding the time to have this conversation today. If you enjoyed listening to it or watching it, depending on how you took the podcast in, we'd appreciate a little feedback, a like, a subscription, maybe even a comment if you've got a moment. We look forward to bringing you more podcasts just like this one as part of the Factor This Policycast partnership with Advanced Energy United. They come out every other Thursday. Until the next one, be good, people. We'll see you.